The smell of formaldehyde and something far worse hit Jonathan Mills like a physical blow the moment he stepped through the doors of Blackwood Sons Funeral Parlor. He had traveled 3 days by coach from Boston, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from his deceased father's old friend. A letter of introduction from his deceased father's old friend. Letter promised honest work and fair wages, learning the undertaker's trade from one of Massachusetts' most respected funeral establishments. What Jonathan found instead was a building that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Blackwood establishment stood at the end of Gallows Hill Road, where the old witch trial grounds had been a century and a half. Earlier local folk still crossed themselves when they passed the place, though they could never quite explain why the building itself was 3 stories of dark granite with windows that seemed to watch the street like hungry eyes. A sign hung above the main entrance, painted in fading gold letters that read Blackwood and Sons, serving the departed since 1798. But there was something wrong with the way the letters seemed to shift in. Jonathan peripheral visioned something that made his skin crawl, even though he could not say exactly what. "You must be the Mills boy," said a voice from the shadows near the entrance. Jonathan turned to see a tall, thin man emerging from what appeared to be solid darkness. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with prematurely white hair and skin so pale it seemed translucent. His eyes were the color of old pewter, and they seemed to look through Jonathan rather than at him. "I am Ezekiel Blackwood," the man continued, extending a hand that felt cold as winter stone. "Welcome to our family business." Jonathan shook the offered hand and immediately regretted it. The man's grip was firm, but there was something fundamentally wrong with the way his fingers moved, as if the bones beneath the skin were arranged differently than they should be. "Your father spoke highly of you in his letters," Ezekiel said, leading Jonathan into the main parlor. "He said you had steady hands and a strong stomach. Both qualities are essential in our line of work." Interior of the funeral home was even more unsettling than the outside. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the natural light, leaving the rooms lit by flickering gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Air was thick with incense and chemicals, but underneath those familiar funeral home scents was something else, something organic and wrong that made Jonathan think of meat left too long in summer heat. "We prepare the dead for their final rest," Ezekiel explained as they walked through a series of increasingly dark corridors. "But our work goes deeper than simple embalming. The Blackwood family has been perfecting techniques for over 50 years, techniques that ensure the departed truly find peace." They passed several closed doors, marked with small brass nameplates: Preparation Room 1, Preparation Room 2, Cold Storage, Private Family Quarters. But it was the last door at the end of the corridor that made Jonathan blood run cold. The nameplate simply read "Research." From behind that door came sounds that had no place in a funeral home. Sounds like sawing, like grinding, like something wet being moved around by careful hands. "What kind of research?" Jonathan asked, though part of him did not want to know the answer. Ezekiel smiled, and Jonathan noticed that his teeth were filed to sharp points. "The kind that improves our services," he said. "The kind that helps families say goodbye properly. You will learn in time. All apprentices eventually learn." They climbed a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, where Jonathan would be staying. The room was small but clean, with a single window that looked out over the town cemetery. "Your quarters," Ezekiel said. "Meals are served downstairs at 6 and midnight, never earlier, never later. The work requires precise timing." Jonathan set down his bag and looked around the sparse room. A narrow bed, a small desk, a basin for washing on the wall, hung a mirror with an ornate silver frame. But when Jonathan looked into it, he saw something that made his breath catch. For just a moment, his reflection showed someone else here. Young man with the same features as Jonathan, but with eyes that held knowledge of terrible things, eyes that seemed to be trying to warn him about something. "Mirror belonged to the previous apprentice," Ezekiel said, noting Jonathan's gaze. "Poor Benjamin." "What happened to Benjamin?" Jonathan asked. "He left suddenly," Ezekiel replied, "in the middle of the night. Some people are not suited for our particular type of work. Some people lacked the necessary dedication that evening. Jonathan joined the Blackwood family for dinner in a dining room that felt more like a mausoleum than a place for the living. Besides Ezekiel, there were 3 other family members. Jeremiah, the eldest son, was a massive man with hands like sledgehammers and a face that seemed carved from granite. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice rumbled like thunder in an empty church. Mordecai, the younger son, was thin like his father, but with nervous energy that made him constantly fidget and twitch. His fingers were stained with chemicals, and there was something manic in his pale blue eyes. And then there was Constance. Ezekiel's daughter was perhaps 25, with dark hair and darker eyes. She moved through the room like smoke, and when she looked at Jonathan, he felt as though she could see directly into his soul. "Tell us about yourself, Jonathan," she said as they ate a meal that tasted somehow wrong despite appearing normal. "What brings a young man to seek work with the dead?" Jonathan told them about his father's passing, about the debts that needed to be paid, about the lack of opportunities in Boston for someone of his limited means. But even as he spoke, he found his attention drifting to the portraits that lined the dining room walls. They showed generations of Blackwood family members, stretching back decades. But there was something disturbing about every single painting. The eyes in each portrait seemed to follow his movement around the room, and every face wore the same expression of hunger, mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. "The Blackwood family has always been in the business of death," Ezekiel said when Jonathan had finished his story. "We understand its rhythms, its requirements, its appetites. Death is not an ending," Constance added. "It is a transformation, and transformation requires sacrifice." Mordecai giggled at something only he could hear. "New blood," he whispered. "Fresh meat for the grinder." Jeremiah hit his brother hard enough to rattle the dishes. "Ignore him," Ezekiel said smoothly. "Mordecai sometimes speaks without thinking. Work can be stressful. It affects different people in different ways." After dinner, Jonathan retired to his room feeling exhausted, despite having done no real work yet. But sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard sounds from somewhere in the building, footsteps in corridors that should have been empty, voices whispering in rooms where no one should be awake. And underlying it all was a rhythmic thumping sound, like a heartbeat or like someone pounding on a door from the inside. Jonathan got up and looked out his window at the cemetery beyond. In the moonlight, he could see fresh graves marked with simple wooden crosses. There seemed to be far more graves than a town this size should need, and some of the crosses looked hastily made, as if they had been put up quickly to hide something. And knock at his door. "Maid." Jonathan jumped. "Come in," he called. Constance entered carrying a cup of tea. She had changed from her dinner dress into a white nightgown that made her look like a ghost. "I thought you might have trouble sleeping," she said. "The first night is always difficult." She handed him the cup and their fingers touched briefly. Her skin was cold as marble. "What happened to Benjamin?" Jonathan asked. "Really?" Constance smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Benjamin asked too many questions," she said. "Just like you are doing now. Some things are better left unknown. Some truths are too terrible for the living to bear." She moved closer, and Jonathan could smell something on her breath. Something that reminded him of the preparation rooms downstairs. "But you are different," she continued. "I can see it in your eyes. You have the hunger, the need to know, the willingness to do whatever is necessary." Jonathan felt dizzy suddenly. The tea tasted bitter and strange. "What did you put in this?" he asked. "Just something to help you sleep," Constance replied. "Something to help you dream the right dreams. Tomorrow your real education begins. Tomorrow you learn what the Blackwood family really does. Tomorrow you discover why the dead never truly rest in our care." As consciousness faded, Jonathan heard Constance whisper something in a language he did not recognize, and in the mirror across the room, he saw the reflection of that other young man again. This time, the face was screaming. This time the eyes were filled with absolute terror. This time Jonathan understood that he was looking at Benjamin, and that Benjamin had never left at all. Jonathan woke to the sound of weeping coming from the walls themselves. Crying seemed to echo through the very bones of the building like water flowing through underground caverns. Sat up in the narrow bed, feeling groggy and disoriented from whatever Constance had put in his tea-pale morning light filtered through the single window, but it did nothing to warm the bone-deep chill that had settled into the room overnight in the mirror across from his bed. Jonathan could see his own reflection, but for a moment, just a moment, he could swear there was someone standing. Behind him, someone with desperate eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. Jonathan spun around, but found only empty air when he looked back at the mirror. His reflection was alone again, but now there were words written in the condensation on the glass, words that had definitely not been there the night before. "Help us before it is too late. Before you become like them." A sharp knock at his door made Jonathan jump. "Time for your first lesson," called Ezekiel's voice through the wood. "The dead do not wait for thee living to be ready." Jonathan dressed quickly and made his way downstairs. The funeral parlor looked different in daylight, though not less menacing. Shadows still clung to the corners despite the morning sun, and that underlying smell of rawness seemed even stronger. He found Ezekiel waiting in what appeared to be the main preparation room. Space was dominated by 3 marble tables, each surrounded by an array of tools that looked more suited to a butcher shop than a funeral home. Saws and knives, and sharp metal instruments whose purposes Jonathan could not even guess today. "You learned the basics," Ezekiel said without preamble, "how to prepare a body for eternal rest. But our methods are different from what you might have learned elsewhere. More thorough, more permanent." On the center table lay a body covered by a white sheet. Ezekiel pulled back the covering to reveal a young woman, perhaps 18 years old. She was pale and still, but there was something about her face that suggested she had died in terrible fear. "Mary Patterson," Ezekiel said, "died yesterday of a fever, according to her family. But we know better, do we? Not. We can see the truth that the living refuse to acknowledge." Jonathan stared at the woman's face. There were no obvious signs of violence, but something about her expression disturbed him deeply. "What truth?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Ezekiel smiled that cold smile and picked up a scalpel from the instrument tray. "That death is never accidental," he said. "That someone always benefits when another person dies. That our job is not just to prepare the dead, but to harvest what they no longer need." He made a precise incision along the woman's collarbone. What flowed out was not blood. It was something thick and dark, and it moved with purpose, as if it were alive. "What is that?" Jonathan gasped, stepping backward. "Life essence," Ezekiel replied calmly. "The animating force that separates the living from the dead. Most funeral homes let it drain away. We collect it, we preserve it, we use it." Jonathan watched in horror as Ezekiel carefully caught the flowing substance in a series of glass vials. "Use it for what? To extend our own lives," Ezekiel said, "to maintain our strength, to ensure that the Blackwood family continues, to serve the community for generations to come. Your predecessor Benjamin was very good at the harvesting until he developed a conscience." Jonathan felt his stomach lurch. "What happened to him?" Ezekiel set down the scalpel and looked at Jonathan with those pewter-colored eyes. "He is still with us," he said, in a manner of speaking. "Would you like to meet him?" Before Jonathan could answer, Ezekiel led him to another room deeper in the basement. This room was different from the preparation areas. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were hundreds of glass jars. Each jar contained what looked like a glowing liquid, and floating in many of the jars were things that Jonathan's mind refused to process. "Our collection," Ezekiel said proudly. 50 years of careful preservation. Life essence from over 3,000 souls. Each one a building block in our family immortality." Jonathan approached one of the shelves on unsteady legs. The jar nearest to him contained something that pulsed with its own light, and as he watched, the substance inside began to form shapes. A face, a young man's face, a face that matched the reflection he had been seeing in his bedroom. "Mirror Benjamin," Jonathan whispered. The substance in the jar pressed against the glass as if trying to reach out, and Jonathan could swear he heard a voice, thin and distant, but unmistakably human. "Run," the voice pleaded. "Before they harvest you too, before you become part of the collection." Ezekiel placed a cold hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Benjamin was gifted," he said. "His essence burns brighter than most. We have been using it to power our preservation techniques for months now. He has been very helpful, even more helpful than when he was alive. Jonathan tried to pull away, but found that his legs would not obey. The room was spinning, and that bitter taste from the night before was back in his mouth. The tea, he gasped. A mild paralytic, Ezekiel confirmed. Derived from nightshade and other useful plants, we find that new apprentices react better to their first lesson when they cannot run away, cannot close their eyes, cannot deny what they are seeing. Jeremiah entered the room carrying what appeared to be another body. This one was wrapped in canvas, but Jonathan could see enough to know it was a man middle-aged from the size, still warm from the way steam rose off the covering, fresh from the Patterson house. Jeremiah rumbled, the husband grief can be so overwhelming, so fatal. Ezekiel nodded approvingly. Excellent timing, he said. Jonathan can observe a complete harvesting, from death to preservation, the full cycle. They unwrapped the body to reveal a man of perhaps 40. His face was contorted in agony, and his hands were stained with something dark. Poison, Ezekiel explained, noting Jonathan's gaze. We convinced him that his wife's death was his fault, that he had failed to protect her. Guilt is such a powerful motivator. People will do terrible things to themselves when they believe they deserve punishment. Jonathan wanted to scream, but found he could barely whisper. You killed them both. We helped them transition, Ezekiel corrected. Death comes to everyone eventually. We simply ensure that it comes when we need it, when the collection requires new specimens, when the family needs fresh life essence. Mordecai appeared in the doorway, his nervous energy more pronounced than ever. Father, he said in that high whining voice, the constable is asking questions about the Patterson deaths, about the unusual number of recent funerals. Ezekiel frowned. Then we will need to move our operation, he said, as we have done before, as the family has always done when the living grow suspicious. Constance can prepare the traveling supplies. Jeremiah can dispose of the evidence, and our new apprentice can join Benjamin in the collection unless he looked at Jonathan with calculating eyes. Unless he proves useful, unless he demonstrates the proper dedication, unless he shows us that he can be trusted with family secrets. The paralysis was beginning to wear off. Jonathan could feel sensation returning to his fingers, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. What do you want from me? He managed to ask. Simple, Ezekiel said. Help us harvest one more specimen. Prove that you understand the necessity of our work. Show us that you can put family loyalty above squeamish morality. He handed Jonathan a vial filled with clear liquid concentrated nightshade. He explained. Tasteless, odorless, fatal within hours. The constable will be here within the hour. Put this in his water. Let nature take its course, and earn your place in the Blackwood family. Jonathan stared at the vial around him. Benjamin essence pulsed frantically against its glass prison, and from somewhere in the building came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The constable coming to investigate, coming to discover the truth, coming to die unless Jonathan found the courage to resist. Choose quickly, Ezekiel said. Family or conscience, life or the collection. Hoofbeats grew louder as Jonathan stared at the poison in his trembling hands. Through the basement window he could see a lone rider approaching on a bay mare. The man wore the dark blue uniform of the Massachusetts State Constabulary, and even from a distance, Jonathan could see the determination in his weathered face. This was not a man who would be easily fooled or turned away. Constable William Harris, Ezekiel said, reading Jonathan's thoughts. 30 years of service, honest as the day is long. Unfortunately, Mordecai giggled from the doorway. He has been asking questions about the fever outbreak. He said about how so many healthy people died so quickly, about why all of them came to us for burial. Smart questions, dangerous questions. Jeremiah cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking bones. I could take care of him, the giant rumbled. Make it look like an accident. No, Ezekiel said sharply. Constables do not simply disappear. Their deaths must appear natural. That is why we have apprentices. He turned those pale eyes back to Jonathan. A young man new to town offers the constable refreshment while he conducts his investigation. Nothing suspicious about that. Nothing to connect us to his unfortunate demise. Jonathan felt the walls of the basement closing in around him. The jars of harvested souls seemed to pulse brighter as if sensing his desperation. Benjamin's essence pressed against its glass prison more frantically. "Do not do it," came that thin, desperate voice. "Do not become what they are. There are worse things than death. There are worse things than the collection." Constance appeared at Jonathan's elbow like smoke. She wore a simple black dress that made her pale skin look luminous in the dim basement light. "The choice is not as difficult as it seems," she whispered. "One life against many, one death, to preserve the family that has served this community for decades. Think of all the peace we have brought to the grieving, all the comfort we have provided, all the eternal rest we have given to the departed." Her cold fingers traced along Jonathan's arm. "Besides," she continued, "the constable is already dying. We poisoned his well water 3 days ago, slow acting but certain. All you would be doing is speeding the inevitable, making his passing more merciful." Jonathan recoiled from her touch. "You poisoned his well." "We poison many wells," Ezekiel said calmly. "It is more efficient than individual doses, less personal, less traceable. The constable has perhaps 6 hours left. With your help he could pass peacefully. Without it he will die in agony, convulsions, bleeding from every opening, screaming until his throat tears." The sound of boots on the front porch echoed through the building. "He is here," Mordecai hissed. "Decision time." Jonathan looked at the vial in his hands. The liquid inside was clear as water, innocent, looking merciful compared to what awaited the constable if he refused. "I cannot," he whispered. "Then Benjamin will have company," Ezekiel said. He gestured to Jeremiah, who stepped forward with arms like tree trunks. "Take our reluctant apprentice to the preservation room," Ezekiel ordered. "Begin the harvesting process, but keep him conscious. I want him to watch what happens to the constable. I want him to understand the price of moral weakness." Jonathan tried to run, but Jeremiah's massive hands closed around his arms like iron shackles as he was dragged toward the preparation tables. Jonathan heard Ezekiel's footsteps climbing the stairs, heard the front door opening, heard voices. "Constable Harris," came Ezekiel's smooth, welcoming tone. "What brings you to our establishment?" "Questions about the recent deaths," came a gruff reply. "Too many people dying of fever, all of them brought here for burial. Seems mighty convenient." "Death is never convenient," Ezekiel replied, "but it is inevitable. Please come in. Let us discuss your concerns properly." Jonathan was strapped to one of the marble table's leather restraints held his arms and legs immobile, but they left his head free to turn, free to watch, free to see what was about to happen in the room above. Constance leaned over him with a scalpel in her pale hands. "This will hurt," she said almost kindly, "but not for long. The life essence flows more freely when the subject is in pain. Fear and agony purify the soul, make it more potent, more useful." She made a small incision along Jonathan's throat. Not deep enough to kill, just deep enough to let the essence begin to flow. Jonathan felt something vital draining out of him, something more than blood, something that made colors seem less vivid, made sounds seem more distant, made the world itself seem less real. "Beautiful," Constance murmured as she caught the flowing essence in a glass container. "Such bright life force, such pure terror. This will keep the family young for months." From upstairs came the sound of conversation, then a chair scraping across wood, then the tinkle of water being poured into a glass. "Drink up," Jonathan heard Ezekiel say. "You look tired. Hard work investigating all these deaths." Then silence. Jonathan closed his eyes and waited for the scream, for the sound of the constable collapsing, for the proof that his refusal to act had doomed an innocent man. Instead, he heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the basement stairs. Jonathan opened his eyes to see Constable Harris descending into the collection room. But he was not alone. Behind him came Ezekiel, and Ezekiel was bound in iron shackles. "Federal Marshal James Crawford," the constable said. "Working under special commission from the governor, I have been tracking the Blackwood family for 3 years, from Connecticut to Rhode Island to here. Always the same pattern: unusual deaths, missing persons, funeral homes that appear and disappear overnight. Jonathan stared in amazement. You knew I suspected, Crawford replied. But I needed evidence. I needed to catch them in the act, so I let them think they had poisoned me, let them believe I was helpless while my men surrounded the building. Jeremiah made a sound like an angry bear and lunged at the Marshal. Crawford shot him twice in the chest. Giant toppled backward into the shelves of preserved souls. Glass shattered, essence spilled across the floor like liquid starlight, and from each broken container came screams. Dozens of voices, hundreds of voices, all the souls the Blackwoods had trapped over the decades, all crying out at once in rage and anguish and terrible relief. The basement filled with cold fire as the freed essences took shape. Translucent figures materialized throughout the room, men and women and children, all bearing the marks of violent death, all staring at their captors with eyes that burned with supernatural fury. No, Ezekiel gasped. The collection. 50 years of work, our immortality. The vengeful spirits surrounded him. Our turn, they whispered in unison. Our turn to harvest, our turn to collect, our turn to preserve. Ezekiel, aged 50 years, in as many seconds. Hair turned white, then fell out entirely. His skin wrinkled and sagged, his teeth cracked and crumbled, and still the spirits pressed closer, draining him as he had drained them, taking back what had been stolen, reclaiming what was theirs by right. Mordecai tried to flee, but the dead children caught him. Their small hands pulled at his essence. Their young voices sang lullabies of vengeance. His nervous laughter became screaming, then whimpering, then silence. Constance, backed against the wall, still holding the scalpel. Please, she begged the approaching spirits. I was only following orders, only doing what my family required. I never wanted to hurt anyone. The dead had heard such pleas before, had made such pleas themselves. They showed her the same mercy the Blackwoods had shown their victims, none at all. Crawford cut Jonathan restraints. Can you walk, he asked. Jonathan tried to stand, but his legs would not hold him. The essence draining had left him weak. As a newborn Benjamin, he managed to whisper. Crawford looked around the destroyed collection room, which jar. Jonathan pointed with a shaking finger. Marshall carefully lifted the container, holding Benjamin essence inside. The glowing substance had formed itself into the shape of a young man. You are safe now, Crawford said gently. All of you are safe. Time to go home, time to rest. Benjamin smiled, and then he was gone, not destroyed, but released, free to go wherever souls go when they are no longer trapped by human greed. One by one, the other spirits followed until only Jonathan and the Marshal remained in the basement of horrors. How many? Jonathan asked weakly. How many did they kill? Crawford looked at the empty jars scattered across the floor. More than we will ever know, he said, but no more, never again. 3 weeks later, Jonathan sat in a Boston hospital bed, still recovering from what the doctors called severe anemia. They had no explanation for how a healthy young man could lose so much blood without any obvious wound. Crawford had told them it was shock from witnessing the Blackwood family murders, a convenient lie that kept the supernatural truth buried. But Jonathan knew better. He could still feel the absence where his life essence had been drained, could still see the translucent quality his skin had taken on, could still hear Benjamin whispering warnings in his dreams. You are not safe yet, the dead apprentice said each night. They were not the beginning. They were not the end. The rot goes deeper than one family. The hunger is older than you know. Crawford visited on a gray October morning, bringing newspapers and official reports. The Blackwood case is closed, he said, settling into the bedside chair. Officially, they died in a fire that consumed their funeral home, a tragic accident. No mention of supernatural elements, no mention of harvested souls. The public could not handle such truths. Jonathan set aside the Boston Herald he had been reading. What about the other properties, he asked. You said they had operated in Connecticut and Rhode Island. All investigated. Crawford replied, all clean. Whatever network they belong to has gone to ground for now, but there was something in the Marshal's eyes that suggested he was not telling the complete truth, something that reminded Jonathan uncomfortably of the way Ezekiel had looked when he was hiding secrets. There's more, Jonathan said. Something you are not telling me. Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a leather portfolio from his coat. The Blackwood's kept extensive records, he said, names, dates, locations, a complete accounting of their operations, including their suppliers. Jonathan felt ice form in his stomach. Suppliers? Where do you think they learned their techniques? Crawford asked. Who taught them how to harvest life essence, how to preserve souls in glass, how to extend their own lives by consuming others? He opened the portfolio and spread several documents across the hospital bed bills, of sale, shipping manifests, letters of instruction, all bearing the same signature at the bottom, Dr. Cornelius Marsh. Jonathan read aloud. The name sounds familiar. It should, Crawford said grimly. He runs the largest medical college in New England, teaches anatomy to half the doctors in Massachusetts, has been pioneering new preservation techniques for over 30 years, and according to these records, he has been selling his methods to funeral homes across the region. Jonathan scanned the documents with growing horror. Many. We have identified at least 12 operations, Crawford replied, all following the same pattern: family-owned funeral homes in small communities, unusual death rates, missing persons who are never found, and all of them receiving regular shipments from Dr. Marsh. One document, in particular, caught Jonathan's attention, a letter dated just 2 months earlier. The Massachusetts specimens have proven most satisfactory. It read, the essence quality is exceptional. We are prepared to expand operations into Maine and New Hampshire. Please send 3 more preservation kits and perhaps another apprentice. The current one is showing signs of conscience. Jonathan's hands began to shake. They were planning to replace me even before I arrived. They knew Benjamin was becoming unreliable. Crawford nodded. According to their correspondence, Benjamin had started asking questions, started refusing to participate in certain harvesting procedures, started talking about going to the authorities, so they requested a replacement, someone young and desperate, someone who could be molded. Jonathan thought back to his father's deathbed, to the mysterious letter that had arrived offering him work too, the series of coincidences that had led him to Salem County. It was all planned from the beginning. Your father owed Dr. Marsh money. Crawford confirmed medical bills from his final illness. Marsh offered to forgive the debt in exchange for a favor: one young man willing to learn the funeral trade, one fresh apprentice for his associates. The hospital room felt suddenly cold. My father knew. Your father was desperate, Crawford said gently. Dying men make desperate choices. He probably thought he was giving you a legitimate opportunity, a chance at honest work. He could not have known what Dr. Marsh really wanted. Jonathan closed his eyes and saw his father as he had been in those final days, wasted by consumption, worried about the debts he would leave behind, grateful when the mysterious doctor had offered treatment. Where is Marsh now? That is the question, Crawford said. His medical college claims he left for Europe 3 weeks ago, a research expedition, but we have found no record of his departure. No ship manifest, no travel documents. He simply vanished. Jonathan opened his eyes. He knows you are investigating, almost certainly, Crawford agreed, which means he is either hiding or preparing to relocate his operations. Either way, we need to find him before he establishes a new network, before more families like the Blackwoods begin harvesting. The marshal gathered up the documents. Have a proposition for you, he said. The federal government is forming a special investigative unit focused on supernatural crimes cases that regular law enforcement cannot handle. We need someone who has experienced these horrors firsthand, someone who understands how the harvesting works, someone who can recognize the signs. Jonathan looked out the hospital window at the bustling Boston street, normal people going about normal lives, unaware of the supernatural predators that moved among them. Want me to hunt them? I want you to stop them, Crawford corrected. Before they can create more victims, before they can build new collections, before they can perfect their techniques. Jonathan thought of Benjamin trapped in that glass prison, of all the souls who had suffered in silence for decades, of the families who had never learned what really happened to their loved ones. What about Dr. Marsh? He is the priority, Crawford said. The source cut off the head and the body dies, but he will not be easy to find. Men like Marsh are experts at hiding, at creating new identities, at Vanishing into plain sight, Jonathan made his decision. When do we start? Crawford smiled for the first time since Jonathan had met him. Your discharge papers are being processed. He said we leave for New Hampshire tomorrow. There have been reports of unusual deaths in a town called Millbrook. Multiple families requesting funeral services from a new establishment, Blackwood and Associates. Jonathan blood turned cold. They are using the name different spelling, Crawford said. But yes, someone is continuing the family business, someone who learned their techniques, someone who escaped our investigation, someone who thinks they can pick up where the others left off as if summoned by their conversation. A knock came at the hospital door. A nurse entered carrying a large bouquet of white lily. Delivery for Mr. Mills, she said cheerfully. No card, but they are beautiful. She set the flowers on the bedside table and left. Crawford examined the arrangement carefully. Hospital policy requires all gifts to be logged, he said. But there is no record of these being delivered. He pulled apart the flower stems. Hidden among the lily was a small glass vial, empty, but recently used, and etched into the glass were familiar words: Blackwood and Associates, serving the departed since 1847. Jonathan felt his partially healed essence wound begin to burn. They know where I am. They know we are coming. Crawford drew his pistol. Then we had better be ready for them, because this time they will not underestimate us. This time they will not show mercy. This time it will be war. The town of Millbrook, New Hampshire, looked like something from a peaceful painting when Jonathan and Crawford arrived by train 2 days later. White church steeples rose above autumn trees. Children played in neat front yards. Smoke drifted from chimneys in the crisp November air. But Jonathan could smell something underneath the surface: normalcy, something that reminded him of the Blackwood funeral home. Something wrong. How many deaths, he asked as their hired carriage rolled down Main Street. 17 in the past month, Crawford replied, consulting his notes. All different causes: fever, heart failure, accidents, but all of them healthy people under 40, all of them processed by Blackwood and Associates. The funeral home sat at the edge of town where the road curved toward the old cemetery. It was smaller than the Salem County establishment, but built in the same dark granite, the same hungry windows, the same sense of being watched. Different building, Jonathan observed. Same feeling. They learn fast, Crawford agreed. But they also make mistakes. He pointed to a figure standing in the funeral home doorway. Even at a distance, Jonathan could see the familiar pale skin and pewter-colored eyes. Impossible, he breathed. Ezekiel Blackwood died. Crawford said, I saw the spirits drain him, saw him age to dust. But knowledge can be transferred, techniques can be taught, and some hungers are too strong to die with their original host. The figure in the doorway seemed to sense their scrutiny. It raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. We need to get closer, Jonathan said. Learn what we are dealing with. Carefully, Crawford cautioned. If this is what I think it is, we are not facing the same enemy. We are facing something worse, something that has learned from the Blackwood failure. That evening they took rooms at the Millbrook Inn and began their investigation. Jonathan posed as a traveling salesman, while Crawford claimed to be researching local history. Both stories gave them excuses to ask questions, to visit local families, to observe the funeral home operations. They discovered was disturbing. Mrs. Henderson lost her husband last week, Jonathan reported. Over dinner, heart attack, perfectly healthy man, but she says the funeral director was so kind, so understanding, made all the arrangements, even suggested she not view the body too traumatic. She was told. Crawford nodded grimly. Similar stories from 3 other families, he said. Quick deaths, closed casket services, and all of them praising the compassionate care they received from a man who calls himself Edgar Blackwood. Ezekiel brother, supposedly come to continue the family business. Jonathan felt his essence wound throb. There was no brother, no. Crawford agreed, which means Edgar Blackwood is either an imposter or something else entirely, something wearing a dead man's identity, something that knows enough about the family to be convincing. They were interrupted by a soft knock at Jonathan's door. A young woman stood in the hallway, holding a covered tray. She was perhaps 20, with dark hair and pale skin, beautiful in the way that made men forget to be cautious compliments of the house, she said. Setting the tray on Jonathan's table, fresh bread and local honey. I'm Sarah, she added. I work at the funeral home part-time, just helping with arrangements. Jonathan felt warning bells in his head. Which funeral home? Blackwood and Associates, Sarah replied, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Perhaps you have heard of us. We provide very personalized service. Crawford hand moved toward his concealed pistol. What kind of service? The kind that helps families through their most difficult times, Sarah said. The kind that ensures their loved ones find proper rest. The kind that has been perfected over generations. She moved closer to Jonathan. You look familiar, she said. Have we met before? I think I would remember, Jonathan replied, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. Yes, Sarah agreed. I am sure you would, just as I am sure we will see each other again very soon. She left as quietly as she had arrived. Crawford immediately checked the food tray. Poise, he confirmed after sniffing the bread. Same chemical signature as the Blackwood compounds. They know who we are. They are testing us, seeing if we will be as easy to eliminate as a small-town constable. Jonathan looked out the inn window toward the funeral home. Lights burned in several windows, despite the late hour, and he could see figures moving inside, more figures than a small operation should need. Many people work there, according to the town records. Just Edgar Blackwood and one assistant, Crawford said, but I count at least 6 different individuals, all moving with purpose, all working late into the night, processing what we need to find out. They waited until after midnight, then made their way through the darkened streets. The funeral home looked abandoned from the outside. Jonathan could hear sounds from within, the same sounds he remembered from Salem County, sawing, grinding, something wet being moved by careful hands. Back entrance, Crawford whispered. They found a cellar door that had been left unlocked, almost as if they were expected. The basement layout was identical to the original Blackwood establishment: preparation rooms, cold storage, and, at the end of the corridor, a door marked research. They copied everything. Jonathan breathed. Not copied, said a familiar voice behind them. Improved. They turned to see Edgar Blackwood emerging from the shadows. But this was not the man Jonathan had glimpsed from the carriage. This was Ezekiel, exactly as he had been in Salem County. Same pale skin, same pewter eyes, same filed teeth, same impossible presence. You died, Crawford said, raising his pistol. I watched you die. Death is a temporary inconvenience, Ezekiel replied, when one has mastered the proper techniques. Dr. Marsh taught us more than simple harvesting. He taught us resurrection. He taught us how to transfer consciousness between bodies. He taught us how to make death meaningless. Behind him came the others. Jeremiah, looking exactly as he had before. Crawford shot him. Mordecai, with that same manic energy. Constance, beautiful and terrible and impossible. The spirits destroyed you, Jonathan said. I saw them drain your essence. They drained our original forms, Constance corrected. But essence can be stored, preserved, transferred to new vessels when needed. Dr. Marsh has been collecting bodies for decades, fresh corpses from medical schools, accident victims, uncreamed remains, all prepared to receive transplanted consciousness, all ready to serve as new homes for old souls. Ezekiel smiled that cold smile. We are not just harvesting life essence anymore, he said. We are achieving true immortality, body after body, life after life. Forever. Crawford fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets passed through Ezekiel without effect. Spiritual forms, Ezekiel explained, anchored to physical reality but not bound by it. Another of Dr. Marsh innovations. We can be solid when we choose incorporeal when convenient. The perfect predators. Jonathan felt the familiar pull of paralysis, but this time he was ready for it. Sarah, he called the girl from the inn, one of our new acquisitions, Constance said proudly. Fresh body, young mind, perfect vessel for expansion. Sarah stepped out of the shadows, but her movements were wrong, stiff and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Help me, she whispered when the Blackwoods were not looking directly at her. Still trapped inside, still fighting. Jonathan understood. Consciousness transfer was not complete. The original souls were still present, struggling against their supernatural occupiers. "Now you understand," Ezekiel said, "why we brought you here. Why? We let you discover our new operation. We need your body, Jonathan. We need your essence, your experience with harvesting makes you valuable. Your survival instincts make you strong. Your youth makes you perfect." The basement filled with cold light, and from the deepest shadows came the figure Jonathan had been dreading, Dr. Cornelius Marsh himself. This was not the elderly academic Jonathan had expected. This was something ancient, something that had been wearing human form for far longer than any mortal lifetime. "My dear boy," Marsh said in a voice like winter wind, "welcome to the future of death and